They say love makes you blind, but sometimes it's betrayal that opens your eyes. Picture this: a penthouse 45 floors above Manhattan. Crystal chandeliers casting shadows on hand-painted walls. A nursery prepared with hope, painted in dreams that will never come true. And a woman 7 months pregnant, standing in the hallway of the Plaza Hotel, listening to the two people she trusted most plan her destruction. She served her purpose. A Spanish architect playing house in my world, it was amusing for a while. The words cut deeper than any blade, because in that moment, she realized the golden cage she'd been living in was built on lies. The fairy tale was a nightmare. The prince was a monster. But here's what they didn't know about the quiet woman with the gentle hands in the architect's mind: when you corner a lioness protecting her cub, you don't get submission, you get war. The reckoning was about to begin. The October rain fell like tears against the floor-to-ceiling windows of the 45th floor penthouse, each droplet catching the amber light from the crystal chandelier that Richard Thompson had imported from Venice for their second anniversary. Elena Martinez Thompson stood in the nursery, her 7 months pregnant belly pressing against the silk of her Hermes maternity dress as she carefully arranged the final touches in what should have been her sanctuary of joy. The room was a masterpiece of luxury and love: walls painted in the softest sage green, hand-carved furniture from the finest Italian craftsmen, and a ceiling mural depicting cherubs and clouds that had taken a team of artists 3 weeks to complete. Every detail had been chosen with meticulous care, from the cashmere blankets embroidered with golden thread to the mobile of tiny crystal stars that tinkled softly in the climate-controlled air. "Baby Thompson will have everything the world can offer," Richard had whispered just weeks ago, his strong arms encircling Elena's growing form as they stood in this very spot, watching the sunset paint Central Park in shades of gold and crimson. "Nothing will ever be too good for our child. My love, you and our baby will want for nothing." Elena had believed him completely. Why wouldn't she? Richard Thompson was a man who turned dreams into reality, who spoke and made millions appear, who had swept her off her feet with grand gestures that seemed lifted from fairy tales. Their courtship had been the stuff of romantic novels, private jets to Paris for weekend getaways, surprise concerts by her favorite musicians, dinner reservations at restaurants that normal people waited months to access. Now, as Elena traced her fingers along the golden nameplate reading "Baby Thompson" that adorned the mahogany crib, she should have felt nothing but anticipation and joy. Instead, a cold dread had been growing in her chest for weeks, a feeling she couldn't quite name, but couldn't dismiss. The signs had been subtle at first: Richard's phone calls that ended abruptly when she entered the room, business trips that seemed to require more formal wear than usual, the faint scent of unfamiliar perfume that clung to his clothes despite his explanations about client meetings and charity galas. Most troubling of all was the gradual cooling of his attention. The man who had once hung on her every word now seemed distracted, distant, as if his mind was perpetually elsewhere. Elena Martinez had not always lived in this golden cage of luxury. Born in San Juan, Puerto Rico, to a family of teachers and social workers, she had learned early that nothing worthwhile came without effort and sacrifice. Her acceptance to Harvard's Graduate School of Design had been earned through scholarships, part-time jobs, and countless nights studying in the library until closing time. She had graduated summa cum laude, established her own small but successful architectural firm, and had been designing affordable housing for hurricane victims when she met Richard Thompson at a charity fundraiser in 2018. The attraction had been immediate and overwhelming. Richard, then 32 and recently inherited his father's real estate empire, was everything Elena had never allowed herself to want: devastatingly handsome, with silver-touched dark hair and eyes the color of storm clouds, confident without being arrogant, generous in ways that seemed to know no bounds. He had approached her at the fundraiser not with the tired pickup lines she expected from wealthy men, but with genuine questions about her work, about the engineering challenges of building hurricane-resistant homes, about her vision for sustainable urban development. Their first date had lasted 18 hours. Richard had picked her up for what she thought would be dinner, and instead whisked her away on his private jet to see the sunrise over the Statue of Liberty from the air. They had talked about everything: her childhood in Puerto Rico, his struggles with living up to his father's legacy, their shared love of classical music and foreign films. By the time they landed back in Manhattan, Elena knew her life had changed forever. The courtship that followed was a whirlwind of romance that still took Elena's breath away to remember. Richard pursued her with the single-minded determination that had made him successful in business, but tempered with a gentleness that spoke to something deeper than mere conquest. He learned Spanish to surprise her on her birthday. He flew her mother and sisters to New York for Christmas and put them up in a suite at the Plaza. He commissioned a renowned artist to paint a mural of El Yunque rainforest in her apartment because she missed the mountains of home. When he proposed on a yacht in the Mediterranean, with the lights of Portofino twinkling like earthbound stars and a string quartet playing Pachelbel's canon, Elena had cried tears of pure joy. She had found her fairy tale prince, and he had chosen her, a girl from a modest Puerto Rican family, to be his queen. The wedding had been featured in Town & Country magazine as one of the most beautiful celebrations of the year. 300 guests had gathered at Richard's family estate in the Hamptons, where white roses and baby's breath had transformed the gardens into something from a dream. Elena's dress, a custom creation by Vera Wang, had taken 6 months to design and featured hand-sewn pearls that had belonged to Richard's grandmother. The reception had lasted until dawn, with dancing under stars and champagne that cost more per bottle than most people earned in a week. For 3 years, Elena had lived in blissful contentment. She had maintained her architectural practice, though on a smaller scale, designing boutique projects for Richard's wealthy friends and contributing pro bono work to housing nonprofits. Richard had encouraged her career, often bragging to their social circle about his brilliant wife, the architect. Their penthouse had become a showcase not just of wealth, but of Elena's exquisite taste and Richard's indulgence of her every aesthetic whim. The pregnancy had been planned and celebrated. Richard had been the one to suggest it was time to start their family, and he had cried with joy when Elena showed him the positive test. He had insisted on the finest maternal care, flying in specialists from London and Switzerland for consultations, converting his home office into a temporary nursery planning center where they spent hours discussing their child's future. But something had changed in recent months. The man who had once planned elaborate date nights now often worked late into the evening. The husband who had once texted her sweet messages throughout the day now responded to her communications with brief, business-like replies. Most painful of all, the lover who had once made her feel like the most beautiful woman in the world now seemed to find excuses to avoid intimacy, citing work stress or concern for the baby's health. Elena had tried to convince herself that these changes were normal, that the stress of impending fatherhood and business pressures were temporary obstacles that would resolve once their child arrived. She had read every pregnancy book, spoken to her doctor, even consulted with a therapist about managing relationship changes during pregnancy. Everyone assured her that what she was experiencing was common, that Richard was probably just nervous about becoming a father. But Elena's intuition, honed by years of reading architectural plans and understanding the structural integrity of complex systems, told her that something fundamental was wrong with the foundation of her marriage. The phone call came at 9:47 p.m. on a Tuesday evening in October. Elena remembered the exact time because she had been practicing the breathing exercises her birthing class instructor had taught her, timing the mild contractions that had been coming and going for days. She had been alone in the penthouse. Richard was supposedly at a client dinner that had run late, the third such dinner that week. The phone rang as Elena was settling into bed with a cup of chamomile tea and the latest issue of Architectural Digest. The caller ID showed unknown, which usually meant a telemarketer or wrong number. Elena almost didn't answer, but something made her pick up. "Hello," she said, expecting to hear the familiar click of an automated system. Instead, she heard a woman's voice, sultry and confident, speaking with the breathless excitement of someone in love. "Darling, I'm waiting for you at the Plaza, room 2405. The voice purred. "I'm wearing that red La Perla set you bought me in Milan, the one with the straps you like." How much longer will this dinner take? I've ordered champagne and strawberries, and I'm getting very lonely without you. Elena's blood turned to ice in her veins. The voice was unmistakable Victoria Sterling, the 24-year-old model and aspiring actress whom Richard had introduced as a business associate at countless charity events and gallery openings. Victoria, with her platinum blonde hair and surgically enhanced curves, who always seemed to find reasons to touch Richard's arm during conversations, who laughed too loudly at his jokes, who looked at Elena with barely concealed contempt disguised as false sweetness. I think you have the wrong number, Elena managed to whisper, her voice barely audible over the thundering of her heart. Oh God, is this his wife? Victoria's voice changed instantly, becoming sharp with panic. I thought I was calling his business phone. I... The line went dead, but the damage was done. Elena sat in the sudden silence of her bedroom, the phone still pressed to her ear, as her world crumbled around her like a house built on sand. For several minutes, Elena couldn't move, couldn't think, couldn't breathe. The baby kicked violently in her womb as if sensing her mother's distress, and the movement snapped Elena back to reality. She looked around the bedroom she had shared with Richard for 3 years, the king-size bed where he had whispered words of love, the sitting area where they had planned their future, the walk-in closet where his absence now seemed glaringly obvious. With shaking hands, Elena reached for her phone and called Richard's cell phone. It went straight to voicemail. She tried his office line, but it was after hours and went unanswered. Finally, she called the restaurant where Richard claimed to be having dinner. The maitre d' confirmed what Elena already knew in her heart: no reservations under the Thompson name. No private dining rooms booked for business meetings. Elena's mind raced through every interaction she had witnessed between Richard and Victoria over the past year. The way Victoria always seemed to appear at events where Elena felt most out of place, art gallery openings, where the conversation revolved around artists Elena didn't know, charity galas for causes she hadn't chosen, business dinners where she was the only wife in attendance. The way Richard's demeanor changed when Victoria was around, becoming more animated, more flirtatious, more like the man he had been during their courtship. The pieces of the puzzle fell into place with sickening clarity. The late nights, the business trips, the gradual emotional distance, the phone calls that ended when she entered the room. Richard wasn't just having an affair, he was living a double life. Elena forced herself to stand, to move, to think beyond the immediate shock. She needed to know the truth, all of it, before she could decide what to do. With a determination that surprised her, Elena, dressed in dark clothes, grabbed her keys and headed for the Plaza Hotel. The drive through Manhattan felt surreal, as if she were moving through someone else's life. Traffic lights blurred through her tears, and the familiar sounds of the city seemed muffled and distant. Elena had driven these streets hundreds of times, but tonight they felt foreign, threatening, as if the entire city was conspiring to hide truths she wasn't supposed to discover. The Plaza Hotel rose before her like a monument to everything she had thought her life represented: luxury, elegance, permanence. The doorman, who recognized her from previous visits with Richard, greeted her with professional courtesy, but Elena saw something in his eyes: pity, perhaps, or uncomfortable knowledge. How many people knew about Richard's betrayal? How long had she been the only one living in ignorance? Room 2405 was on the 24th floor. Elena's hands trembled as she pressed the elevator button, and the ride up felt like ascending to her own execution. The hallway was quiet, carpeted in deep burgundy that muffled her footsteps as she approached the door that would forever divide her life into before and after. She could hear voices through the door, Richard's familiar baritone and Victoria's melodic laugh. For a moment, Elena considered turning around, pretending the phone call had never happened, returning to the comfortable delusion of her marriage. But the baby kicked again, reminding her that she was no longer just responsible for her own happiness. Elena pulled out her phone and began recording as she pressed her ear to the door. I still can't believe she hasn't figured it out, Victoria was saying, her voice carrying clearly through the thin hotel walls. I mean, how naive can one woman be? You've been staying here 3 nights a week for 6 months. Elena sees what she wants to see, Richard replied, his voice carrying a casual cruelty that Elena had never heard before. She's always been idealistic that way. It's part of her charm, I suppose, but also her weakness. Well, I'm tired of hiding, Victoria declared petulantly. When are you going to divorce her? I want to be able to post photos of us together. Go to events as a couple. I'm tired of pretending to be your business associate. After the baby is born, Richard said matter-of-factly, I need the child for inheritance purposes. The Thompson Family Trust requires an heir to maintain control of the companies. But once that's secured, we can move forward with our plans. Elena felt bile rise in her throat. She was nothing more than a broodmare to the man she had loved with every fiber of her being. What about Elena? Victoria asked. She's not going to just disappear quietly. She's more attached to you than I expected when we started this. Elena is soft, Richard said dismissively. Sentimental. She'll be hurt, of course, but she's not equipped for a real fight, a generous settlement, some time to feel sorry for herself, and she'll move on. Women like Elena always do. They find some nice, boring man who appreciates their domestic skills. And if she doesn't want to move on quietly, Richard's laugh was cold and calculating. Then we make it worth her while to disappear. Elena's family is still in Puerto Rico, still vulnerable to economic pressures. Her mother works for the public school system. It would be tragic if budget cuts eliminated her position. Her sister's nonprofit depends on donor funding that could dry up very quickly. Elena's blood turned to ice. Richard wasn't just planning to abandon her. He was prepared to destroy her family if she resisted. You're brilliant, Victoria cooed. This is why I chose you over all the other rich men who wanted me. You think strategically. I learned from the best, Richard replied. My father taught me that sentiment is the enemy of success. You identify what you want, you acquire it, and when it no longer serves your purposes, you dispose of it efficiently. And what about the baby? Victoria asked. I assume you'll want custody. Partial custody. Certainly. The child will need to be raised with proper values, educated appropriately, but day-to-day care, that's what nannies are for. Besides, Elena's maternal instincts will keep her in line. She'll do anything to avoid losing access to her child. Elena pressed her fist to her mouth to keep from crying out. These people were discussing her baby, her life, her future as if she were a problem to be solved rather than a human being with feelings and rights. I've already spoken to my lawyers about the best strategy, Victoria continued. We can claim she was emotionally unstable during the pregnancy, maybe even suggest she was unfaithful. That architect she worked with on the community center project, David Miller, they spent a lot of time together. It wouldn't be hard to insinuate something inappropriate happened. Brilliant as always, my dear, Richard said, and Elena could hear the sound of a champagne cork popping. This is exactly why I love you. You think like I do. Elena thinks with her heart. You think with your head. She believes in fairy tales and happy endings. You understand that life is about power and positioning? To our future, Victoria said, the clink of glasses audible through the door. And to Elena's very generous contribution to our happiness. Sonam, they laughed together, the sound like broken glass in Elena's ears. She had heard enough, her hands shaking with rage and heartbreak. Elena stopped the recording and stepped back from the door. She needed to leave before she did something that would compromise her position later. But as she turned to walk away, Elena's elbow caught the edge of a room service cart that had been left in the hallway. A champagne glass toppled to the floor, shattering with a sound that seemed to echo through the entire corridor. The voices inside the room stopped abruptly. Within seconds, the door swung open, revealing Richard Thompson in a silk robe that Elena had given him for his birthday. His face cycled through shock, anger, and finally, cold calculation. Behind him, Victoria emerged wearing a red negligee that left little to the imagination. Her blonde hair perfectly tousled, her lips curved in a smile that was equal parts triumph and cruelty. Well, well, Victoria said, her voice dripping with false sweetness. Look what the cat dragged in. Elena, Darling, what are you doing lurking around hotel corridors that can't be good for the baby? Elena found her voice, though it came out as barely more than a whisper. 7 years, she said, looking directly at Richard. 7 years I've loved you. I gave up my career, my independence, my entire life for you. Richard's face showed no remorse, only irritation at having his plans discovered prematurely. What did you expect to find here? Elena. Yes, Victoria and I are together. Yes, we have plans for the future. You're an intelligent woman. Surely you could see this coming. See this coming? Elena's voice rose, her Puerto Rican accent becoming more pronounced as her emotions peaked. You told me I was the love of your life. You cried when I told you about the baby. You planned this nursery with me. Chose names. Talked about our family's future. The baby was... Richard paused, choosing his words carefully. Convenient. Every empire needs an heir. Elena, that doesn't mean I need to be tied to someone who was never truly suited for this world. Victoria stepped forward, her cruelty now fully unveiled. Face it, Elena, you were always temporary. A nice distraction while Richard figured out what he really wanted. But men like Richard need wives who can match their ambition, their social status, their understanding of how power really works. Elena felt the baby kick violently, as if responding to her emotional distress. She placed her hands protectively over her belly, finally understanding that she was completely alone in this. You see, Victoria continued, gesturing at Elena's protective stance, so predictable, so maternal. Richard doesn't need a mother. Elena, he needs a partner, someone who can help him build his empire, not someone who wants to nest and bake cookies. Get out, Richard said suddenly, his voice flat and emotionless. Go home. Elena, pack your things. I'll have my lawyers contact you tomorrow with settlement terms. $500,000 and monthly support for the child. That's more than generous for someone in your situation. My situation? Elena laughed bitterly. You mean being pregnant with your child, being your wife, being someone who loved you unconditionally. Your situation, Richard repeated coldly, is that you're about to be divorced from a very wealthy man who could make your life very difficult if you choose to be unreasonable about this. Take the settlement, Elena, disappear quietly, find some nice teacher or social worker who appreciates your domestic inclinations. Elena stared at the man she'd married, searching for any trace of the person who had once made her believe in fairy tales. But Richard Thompson, the real Richard Thompson, was standing before her now, and he was a stranger. You have 48-hour, Victoria added helpfully. Richard's lawyers are very efficient, and I'm sure you don't want this to become any more public than necessary. Think about your family in Puerto Rico. They wouldn't want to see you dragged through a messy divorce in the tabloids. The threat was subtle but clear. Elena nodded slowly, understanding that resistance would bring consequences not just for her, but for everyone she loved. She walked away from that hotel room feeling as though her entire identity had been erased. But as she sat in her car in the plaza's parking garage, rain streaming down the windows and her baby moving restlessly in her womb, something began to crystallize in Elena's mind. She had been underestimated before by professors who doubted a Puerto Rican girl could succeed at Harvard, by clients who thought she was too young to handle major projects, by colleagues who assumed her marriage to Richard meant she wasn't serious about her career. Each time, Elena had proved them wrong through intelligence, determination, and careful preparation. Richard Thompson had made the same mistake everyone else had made. He had confused gentleness with weakness, kindness with naivety. He thought Elena Martinez was a soft, sentimental woman who would quietly accept whatever crumbs he chose to give her. He was about to learn exactly how wrong he was. As Elena drove home through the rain-soaked streets of Manhattan, she began to plan. She thought about the conversations she had overheard, the business dealings that had never quite made sense, the financial documents she had glimpsed in Richard's study. She thought about Victoria's confident assumption that Elena would disappear without a fight. Most importantly, she thought about the baby growing inside her, a child who deserved better than a father, who viewed them as a business asset and a mother who accepted defeat without a battle. Elena Martinez Thompson was about to become the most dangerous woman Richard Thompson had ever crossed. The war for her life and her child's future was just beginning. 48 hours later, Elena Martinez Thompson stood in the marble lobby of a rundown apartment building in Queens, her life reduced to 3 suitcases and a heart full of rage disguised as numbness. The building's superintendent, a weathered Puerto Rican woman named Carmen Delgado, looked at Elena's pregnant form with a mixture of sympathy and suspicion. "Mija, you sure about this place?" Carmen asked in Spanish, her keys jingling as she led Elena toward the ancient elevator. "It's not exactly what someone like you is used to. 4th floor, no working elevator half the time, heat that comes and goes like a bad boyfriend, and the neighbors." She shrugged expressively. Elena surveyed the lobby with an architect's eye, noting the water damage on the walls, the cracked linoleum floor, the fluorescent lights that flickered with electrical problems. 6 months ago, she would have been here professionally, designing renovation plans to transform this building into something beautiful and functional. Today, she was here as a refugee from her own life. "It's perfect," Elena said firmly, though her voice wavered slightly. "How much for the security deposit? First month, last month, and security 4,500 total?" Carmen replied, studying Elena's face. "You running from something, mija, because if you are, I got rules about drama following my tenants home." Elena almost laughed at the irony. Drama was exactly what she was running from, but not the kind Carmen probably meant. "Just a divorce," she said simply. "I need a place to start over." Carmen's expression softened. She had seen enough women in Elena's situation to recognize the particular kind of exhaustion that came from having your world destroyed by someone who was supposed to love you. "Okay, but no men allowed up after 10 p.m., no loud music, and if you're planning to have the baby here, you let me know so I can make sure the heat works in your unit." The apartment was a cruel contrast to the penthouse Elena had called home for 3 years. The single bedroom barely fit a double bed. The kitchen was smaller than the walk-in closet she had shared with Richard, and the living room had windows that faced the brick wall of the adjacent building. Water stains bloomed across the ceiling like dark flowers, and the hardwood floors were scratched and dulled with age. But it was hers. For the first time in years, Elena was in a space that belonged entirely to her, where no one could make decisions about her life without her consent. That first night, Elena sat on the bare floor of her new apartment, her back against the wall and her hands resting on her swollen belly. Her phone had been buzzing constantly, calls from Richard's lawyers, from concerned friends who had heard rumors about the separation, from reporters who had somehow gotten wind that the Thompson marriage was in trouble. She had turned it off hours ago, needing silence to think. The baby was active tonight, kicking and turning as if sensing the upheaval in their lives. Elena spoke to her unborn child in Spanish, the language of her childhood and her heart. "Escúchame, mi amor," she whispered. "Your papi thinks we are weak, that we will disappear quietly like good little women, but he doesn't know who we really are. Does he? He married Elena the architect, but he never met Elena the fighter." As she spoke, Elena began to remember who she had been before Richard Thompson swept her off her feet. She had been a woman who designed buildings that could withstand hurricanes, who had fought for every scholarship and every client, who had built a successful business from nothing but talent and determination. That woman was still inside her, buried under years of luxury and false security, but not dead. Elena spent the next 3 days moving through her new life like a woman in a trance. She bought basic furniture from thrift stores and discount retailers, learning to live on a budget for the first time in years. She registered for prenatal care at a community clinic, trading the Park Avenue specialists for overworked but dedicated doctors who treated her with kindness despite her obvious fall from wealth. Most importantly, she began to think systematically about her situation. Elena pulled out a legal pad, the same kind she had used for architectural planning, and began to map out everything she knew about Richard's business practices. The exercise revealed more than she had expected. Over 3 years of marriage, Elena had been present for hundreds of business conversations, dinner parties, and casual encounters with Richard's associates. As an architect, she had been trained to listen for details, to understand how complex systems functioned, to spot structural weaknesses that others might miss. Richard Thompson, she realized, had been far more careless with his secrets than he knew. Elena remembered late-night phone calls where Richard spoke in code about cleaning money and special projects in the Cayman Islands. She recalled dinner parties where business associates made jokes about buildings that existed on paper and investors who were better off not asking too many questions. She thought about the times Richard had asked her to leave the room during certain business calls, the way conversation stopped when she entered his study, the locked filing cabinets and password-protected computers she had been told contained boring financial stuff, but most telling of all were the architectural inconsistencies. Elena had been trained to understand Manhattan real estate, and some of Richard's claimed projects simply didn't make sense. Buildings that were supposedly being constructed on lots that were too small, residential towers in areas zoned for commercial use, luxury developments in neighborhoods that couldn't support the demographics. As an architect, Elena knew that Richard either didn't understand real estate development, which was impossible given his success, or he was deliberately creating fictional projects. On the fourth day, Elena received an unexpected visitor. Maria Santos knocked on her door at precisely 8 a.m., carrying 2 cups of coffee from a nearby Dominican cafe and a box of pastries that smelled like Elena's childhood in San Juan. Maria had been Elena's closest friend at Harvard, a brilliant legal mind who had chosen to focus on family law and women's rights rather than pursue the corporate track that would have made her wealthy. "I heard what happened," Maria said simply, embracing Elena carefully around her pregnant belly. "And before you say anything about not being able to afford legal help, let me stop you right there." Maria was a force of nature, 5 feet 2 inches of concentrated determination, with curly black hair that refused to be tamed and dark eyes that could see through any lie. She had grown up in the Bronx, the daughter of Dominican immigrants, and had fought for everything she had achieved. If anyone could understand Elena's situation, it was Maria. "I can't pay you what you're worth," Elena began, but Maria waved her objection away. "Rich men like Richard Thompson have been destroying women for decades," Maria said firmly. "They use their money and power to crush anyone who challenges them, and they get away with it because most women can't afford to fight back. Well, you've got me now, and I've been waiting my entire career for a case like this." As they sat in Elena's sparsely furnished living room, sharing coffee and planning, Elena felt hope stirring for the first time since the Plaza Hotel. Maria was more than a lawyer, she was a strategist, an investigator, and most importantly, someone who understood that this battle was about more than just one woman's divorce. "Tell me everything," Maria said, pulling out a legal pad identical to the one Elena had been using. "Every conversation you overheard, every business associate you met, every document you might have seen. Men like Richard always underestimate their wives. They think we're decorative, that we don't understand business. They have no idea how much we actually observe." Elena's memory was extraordinary. Years of architectural training had taught her to notice details, to understand spatial relationships, to remember specifications and measurements with precision. As she recounted her observations about Richard's business practices, Maria's excitement grew visibly. "Elena," Maria said, leaning forward intensely, "I think your husband has been doing much more than just having an affair. What you're describing sounds like a massive money laundering operation disguised as real estate development." "But I don't have actual proof," Elena protested. "It's all circumstantial conversations, observations, things that seemed odd but that I never questioned." "Then we get proof," Maria said with the confidence of someone who had built a career on solving impossible cases. "You said Richard keeps documents in a safe at the penthouse." Elena nodded slowly. "Behind a false panel in his study. The combination is his birthday, October 15th. But Maria, breaking into my own home would still be, it would be retrieving your personal belongings from your marital residence," Maria corrected with lawyerly precision. You're still legally married. The penthouse is still legally your home, and you have every right to access your own possessions. Elena understood what Maria was really saying. This was her chance to level the playing field, to transform from victim to opponent in the war Richard had declared on her life. That afternoon, while Richard was at his weekly golf game at the country club, and Victoria was at what her social media claimed was a photo shoot in Brooklyn, Elena returned to the penthouse that had been her home for 3 years. Walking through the familiar rooms felt like visiting a museum of her former life. Everything was exactly as she had left it. The fresh flowers in crystal vases, the carefully arranged art books on the coffee table, the throw pillows she had chosen to complement the Italian leather furniture. But now these objects felt like props in a stage play, beautiful but ultimately meaningless. The nursery door was closed. Elena stood outside for several minutes, gathering the courage to enter the room where she had spent so many hours dreaming of her future as a mother. When she finally opened the door, the sight nearly broke her resolve. The crib she had assembled with such care, the mobile of crystal stars, the walls painted with love and hope, it all remained exactly as she had left it, a shrine to dreams that would never be realized. Elena allowed herself exactly 3 minutes to grieve in that room. Then she closed the door firmly and went to Richard's study. The study was Richard's private domain, rich mahogany paneling. Leather-bound books he had never read, but that looked impressive, and a massive desk where he conducted the business that had built his empire. Elena had been in this room hundreds of times, but always as a visitor in Richard's space. Tonight, she was here as an investigator. The false panel was hidden behind a first-edition collection of Charles Dickens that Richard had bought for decoration. Elena slid the books aside and revealed the electronic safe that she had discovered years earlier while looking for Christmas presents to wrap. At the time, Richard had laughed about her discovery and casually given her the combination in case of emergencies. October 15th, 1989. Richard's birthday. The safe clicked open with a soft electronic beep. Inside was a collection of documents that made Elena's breath catch in her throat. Bank statements showing transfers of millions of dollars to accounts in the Cayman Islands, Switzerland, and Luxembourg. Contracts for real estate developments that Elena knew had never been built. She had researched every major construction project in Manhattan as part of her own architectural work. Most damning of all was a USB drive labeled VCS Projects, Victoria Sterling's initials. Elena's hands shook as she photographed each document with her phone and copied the files from the USB drive to a backup device she had brought. The scale of the fraud was breathtaking. Richard hadn't just inherited a successful real estate business from his father. He had been systematically defrauding investors, creating phantom development projects, and using offshore accounts to hide the stolen money. But as Elena was finishing her work, she heard a sound that made her blood run cold, the distinctive chime of the private elevator that accessed the penthouse. Richard was home early from his golf game, heart pounding. Elena quickly closed the safe, replaced the books, and slipped behind the heavy velvet curtains that flanked the study's windows. She pressed herself against the wall, trying to control her breathing as footsteps approached the study. "Are you absolutely certain she doesn't suspect anything about the Cayman accounts?" Victoria's voice carried clearly as she and Richard entered the room. "Elena is too trusting for her own good," Richard replied with casual cruelty. "She thinks the world operates on honesty and good intentions. It's almost pitiable. Really." "What about after the baby is born?" Victoria asked. "We can't risk her discovering anything that might complicate our plans." "The child will be raised by nannies," Richard said dismissively. "Elena can have supervised visitation if she behaves herself. If she doesn't—" He left the threat hanging ominously. Elena pressed her fist to her mouth to keep from crying out. They were discussing her child, her future, her life as if she were a business problem to be managed rather than a human being with rights and feelings. "I still think we should consider more permanent solutions," Victoria said with chilling casualness. "Pregnant women have accidents all the time. Slip and fall injuries, complications during delivery, postpartum depression that leads to tragic outcomes." "Too risky," Richard replied thoughtfully. "This way is cleaner. Legal. Elena gets a settlement that keeps her comfortable but powerless, and we get everything we want without messy investigations. You're probably right, Victoria conceded. But I want her completely out of our lives. No contact, no claims on your time or attention. She needs to understand that she was temporary, that what we have is permanent. Oh, she'll understand, Richard said with cold satisfaction. Women like Elena always do. They're sentimental creatures who eventually accept their place in the world. Elena listened to these two people, one whom she had loved completely, the other whom she had tried to like for his sake, discuss her destruction with the casual tone they might use to plan a dinner party. The betrayal was so complete, so devastating, that it moved beyond heartbreak into something harder and more dangerous. For 2 hours, Elena remained hidden behind the curtains while Richard and Victoria planned her humiliation in methodical detail. They discussed financial strategies for minimizing her settlement, legal maneuvers to limit her access to Isabella, and social tactics to ensure she would be ostracized from Manhattan's wealthy circles. But most importantly, they revealed details about their money laundering operation that Elena could never have discovered otherwise. Victoria wasn't just Richard's mistress, she was his full partner in crime, with her own offshore accounts and her own network of contacts who helped move stolen money around the world. When they finally left to meet friends for dinner, Elena emerged from her hiding place with evidence that could destroy them both. The USB drive felt like it was burning a hole in her pocket as she made her way out of the penthouse and back to her new life in Queens. That night, Elena met with Maria and Marcus Rodriguez, a former FBI investigator who now worked as a private detective specializing in financial crimes. Marcus was a serious man in his 50s, gray-haired and soft-spoken, who had spent 20 years building cases against white-collar criminals. Mrs. Thompson, Marcus said after reviewing the documents Elena had obtained, your husband isn't just an unfaithful spouse, he's the head of a sophisticated criminal organization. This USB contains evidence of money laundering, securities fraud, and conspiracy that could result in decades of prison time. What about Victoria? Elena asked. Ms. Sterling is much more than a mistress, Marcus replied grimly. Based on these financial records, she's been Richard's partner in crime for at least 2 years. She has 3 offshore accounts that have received over $15 million in transfers from Richard's fraudulent deals. Maria leaned forward intently. Elena, with this evidence, we're not just talking about a divorce settlement. We're talking about justice. We're talking about federal prison time for both of them. As Elena sat in her small Queens apartment that night, feeling her baby move restlessly in her womb, she understood that her life had reached a turning point. She could take the evidence to the authorities immediately and watch Richard and Victoria face criminal prosecution, or she could be strategic, building an even stronger case while pretending to be the defeated wife Richard expected her to be. Elena chose strategy. For the next 8 weeks, Elena lived a carefully crafted double life. Publicly, she played the role of the heartbroken wife who was too overwhelmed by pregnancy and divorce to fight back effectively. She met with Richard's lawyers and pretended to negotiate settlement terms from a position of weakness. She allowed Richard's friends and business associates to treat her with the mixture of pity and dismissal that they thought appropriate for a discarded wife. Privately, Elena was building the most comprehensive case of financial fraud in Manhattan's recent history. Working with Maria and Marcus, Elena documented every aspect of Richard's criminal enterprise. They traced money flows through multiple offshore accounts, identified victims of his fraudulent schemes, and connected Victoria to a network of money laundering operations that extended across 3 continents. Elena also began rebuilding her own life. She re-established contact with architectural colleagues she had neglected during her marriage, quietly letting them know that she would be returning to work after her maternity leave. She researched childcare options in Queens, finding a wonderful Puerto Rican grandmother named Esperanza who ran a small daycare in her home and spoke to Elena's daughter exclusively in Spanish. Most importantly, Elena began to heal emotionally. The sharp pain of Richard's betrayal gradually transformed into something harder but less destructive, a cold determination to ensure that he faced consequences for his actions. Isabella Martinez Thompson was born on December 15th, during the first snowstorm of winter. Elena labored for 14 hours in a public hospital in Queens, surrounded by Maria and Esperanza, rather than the team of Park Avenue specialists Richard had originally arranged. The birth was difficult but ultimately triumphant. Isabella emerged healthy and beautiful, with her mother's dark eyes and a cry that announced her presence to the world with unmistakable authority. Richard sent flowers to the hospital with a card that read, "Congratulations on our daughter." He didn't visit. Victoria posted photos on social media from a spa weekend in the Hamptons, celebrating the new chapter in her life. She didn't acknowledge Isabella's existence. As Elena held her daughter for the first time, she made a promise that would shape everything that followed. "Mi amor," she whispered in Spanish, "your mommy is going to make sure you grow up in a world where powerful men can't destroy women without consequences. I promise you that." 3 months after Isabella's birth, Elena was ready for war. She had lost 30 pounds, regained her energy, and assembled a legal team that included not just Maria, but also federal prosecutors who were eager to bring down a high-profile financial criminal. The evidence against Richard and Victoria was overwhelming and irrefutable. Elena had documented their crimes with the precision of an architect designing a skyscraper. Every detail was verified. Every connection was solid. Every structural element was designed to bear the weight of scrutiny. But Elena wanted more than just criminal convictions. She wanted Richard to face her in court, to look her in the eyes as his world crumbled the way hers had crumbled that night at the Plaza Hotel. She wanted him to understand that the quiet Spanish architect he had underestimated was the author of his destruction. The divorce trial was scheduled for April 15th. Richard's lawyers expected a quick settlement negotiation, followed by an amicable division of assets. They had no idea that Elena Martinez Thompson was about to deliver the most devastating legal performance in Manhattan family court history. As spring arrived in New York and Isabella began to smile and reach for the world around her, Elena felt a peace she hadn't experienced since her childhood in Puerto Rico. She was no longer Richard Thompson's wife or Victoria Sterling's victim. She was Elena Martinez, architect, mother, and warrior, and she was ready to build something beautiful from the wreckage of her marriage. Justice was coming, and it would be exactly as precise and unforgiving as Elena had learned to be. The morning of April 15th dawned clear and bright over Manhattan, with that particular quality of spring light that made the city's steel and glass towers gleam like jewels. Elena Martinez Thompson stood before the floor-length mirror in her Queens apartment, adjusting the navy blue Armani suit she had bought specifically for this day. The suit was severe, professional, and designed to project power rather than vulnerability, exactly the image Elena needed to convey. 3-month-old Isabella slept peacefully in her carrier, oblivious to the fact that this day would determine the entire trajectory of her future. Elena had chosen to bring her daughter to court not for sympathy, but as a reminder of what she was fighting for. This wasn't just about revenge or justice. It was about ensuring that Isabella grew up in a world where women like Elena couldn't be discarded and destroyed by men like Richard. Maria Santos arrived at 7 a.m. sharp, carrying a thermos of Cuban coffee and the confident energy of a woman who had spent months preparing for the most important case of her career. Behind her, Marcus Rodriguez wheeled a cart loaded with evidence that would systematically dismantle Richard Thompson's life, piece by carefully documented piece. "Ready to make history?" Maria asked, embracing Elena carefully so as not to wrinkle her suit. "I've been ready since that night at the plaza," Elena replied, her voice steady and calm. "Today, Richard Thompson learns what happens when you underestimate a woman who has nothing left to lose." The media circus outside the Manhattan courthouse was unprecedented. News vans from every major network lined the streets. Photographers fought for position behind police barriers, and reporters thrust microphones at anyone who looked remotely connected to the case. The divorce of real estate mogul Richard Thompson had captured public attention. But what the media didn't know was that this case would expose financial crimes that reached into the highest levels of New York's business establishment. As Elena climbed the courthouse steps with Isabella in her arms, she felt the weight of hundreds of cameras capturing her image. This was the moment that would define her public identity, not as Richard Thompson's discarded wife, but as the woman who brought him to justice. Elena kept her expression calm and dignified, refusing to give the media the image of a broken victim they were hoping to capture. Inside the courthouse, the atmosphere was electric with anticipation. The gallery was packed beyond capacity with reporters, curious onlookers, FBI agents, and representatives from the Securities and Exchange Commission. Word had leaked that this case involved more than marital infidelity, that federal prosecutors were prepared to use Elena's testimony as the foundation for criminal charges that could reach some of Manhattan's most powerful figures. Richard sat at the defendant's table, looking every inch the successful businessman charcoal gray suit, silver hair perfectly styled, projecting an image of casual confidence that had served him well in countless business negotiations. His legal team from Whitman and Associates surrounded him like armor, 5 of Manhattan's most ruthless and expensive attorneys, known for their ability to destroy opposing witnesses and manipulate legal proceedings in favor of their wealthy clients. At the table directly behind Richard, Victoria Sterling occupied a seat with the proprietary air of someone who believed her victory was inevitable. She wore a white Oscar de la Renta dress that was clearly meant to project innocence and respectability, and she kept her hand possessively on Richard's shoulder whenever cameras were pointed in their direction. Elena took her place at the plaintiff's table with Maria and their small but formidable legal team. The contrast was deliberate and striking, where Richard projected wealth and power. Elena projected integrity and determination. Where Richard's team looked like corporate raiders, Elena's team looked like public servants committed to justice. Judge Margaret Chen entered the courtroom with the authority of someone who had spent 25 years dispensing justice in New York's most complex and high-profile cases. She was known throughout the legal community for her brilliant legal mind, her intolerance for courtroom theatrics, and her reputation for absolute fairness regardless of a defendant's wealth or political connections. "This court is now in session," Judge Chen announced, her voice carrying clearly through the packed courtroom. "We are here today for the divorce proceedings of Thompson versus Thompson. However, I have been made aware that this case involves allegations and evidence that extend far beyond the dissolution of a marriage." Richard's lead attorney, James Whitman, stood immediately. Whitman was a silver-haired predator in a $3,000 suit, famous throughout Manhattan for his ability to destroy opposing parties with surgical precision while maintaining an appearance of respectability and reason. "Your Honor," Whitman began in the smooth, cultured tones that had intimidated countless opponents, "my client, Richard Thompson, is a respected businessman who has contributed hundreds of millions of dollars to the city's economy and tens of millions to charitable causes. He is here today hoping for a quick and amicable resolution to an unfortunate marital situation that has been greatly complicated by his wife's unrealistic expectations and vindictive behavior." Whitman's strategy was immediately clear paint Elena as a gold-digging opportunist who had trapped Richard into marriage and was now seeking to profit from their separation through false accusations and emotional manipulation. "Mrs. Thompson, or perhaps I should refer to her by her maiden name, Ms. Martinez, has made increasingly wild and desperate accusations in an attempt to increase her settlement beyond what any reasonable person would consider appropriate," Whitman continued, his voice carrying subtle notes of condescension and barely disguised racism. "She claims that my client was unfaithful, but the evidence will show that she herself had an inappropriate relationship with a colleague, architect David Miller, during the later stages of her pregnancy." Elena felt anger flash through her veins, but Maria's steady hand on her arm kept her expression calm and focused. They had expected this attack. Richard's team would try to destroy Elena's credibility by any means necessary. "Furthermore," Whitman continued with theatrical precision, "my client has been more than generous in his settlement offer. $500,000 in cash, plus monthly support for the child, represents far more financial security than someone of Ms. Martinez's background could have expected to achieve through her own efforts." The subtle racism in his words was unmistakable, and Elena saw several reporters in the gallery scribbling furiously. Whitman was making the classic mistake of wealthy men, assuming that Elena's Puerto Rican heritage made her somehow less worthy of respect or consideration. However, Whitman concluded with theatrical flair, if Miss Martinez insists on proceeding with these frivolous and defamatory claims, my client is prepared to defend his reputation and his business interests against all false accusations. We are confident that the evidence will show Ms. Martinez to be exactly what she appears to be, an opportunistic woman who is attempting to destroy a good man's reputation for financial gain. Judge Chen turned to Maria with an expression that revealed nothing of her thoughts. Ms. Santos, please present your opening statement. Maria rose slowly, her movements deliberate and controlled. When she spoke, her voice was clear and unwavering, carrying the conviction of someone who had spent months preparing for this moment. Your Honor, my client is not here today seeking charity or seeking to profit from the dissolution of her marriage. She is here seeking justice not just for herself and her daughter, but for the dozens of investors who have been defrauded by Mr. Thompson's criminal enterprise. The courtroom erupted in whispers and murmurs. Whitman objected immediately, but Judge Chen silenced him with a single look. Over the next several hours, Maria continued, her voice rising with controlled passion, we will present evidence that Mr. Thompson has been operating a sophisticated money laundering operation disguised as real estate development. We will prove that he has defrauded investors of over $50 million through fake construction projects and phantom developments. We will prove that his relationship with Ms. Victoria Sterling was not just an extramarital affair, but a criminal conspiracy involving multiple offshore accounts and elaborate schemes to hide stolen money from federal authorities. Elena watched Richard's confident facade begin to crack as Maria outlined the scope of their evidence. His lawyers were whispering frantically among themselves, clearly unprepared for the direction this case was taking. Most importantly, Maria concluded, looking directly at Richard, we will prove that Mr. Thompson planned to abandon his pregnant wife and newborn daughter for his criminal partner, and that he was prepared to use threats and intimidation to ensure that my client disappeared quietly from his life. This case, Your Honor, is not about divorce. It's about holding powerful men accountable for their crimes against both individuals and society. The first piece of evidence was the recording Elena had made outside Victoria's hotel room. As Richard's voice filled the courtroom cold, calculating, dismissive of his wife and unborn child, Elena watched his carefully constructed public image begin to disintegrate in real time. Elena, she served her purpose. A Spanish architect playing house in my world, it was amusing for a while. But I need a real partner now. Someone who understands power and isn't distracted by sentiment. Victoria's voice followed, dripping with cruelty and ambition. I'll give you a son, a strong heir, not like that weak woman you married. Spanish women are so emotional, so needy. How could you ever think she was worthy of the Thompson name? The gallery was completely silent, except for the scratching of pens and the quiet clicking of cameras. Elena saw several members of the jury. Yes, Richard had insisted on a jury trial, confident that his wealth and status would influence their decision, looking at him with undisguised disgust. Richard's response on the recording was even more damaging. After the baby is born, we move forward with our plans. I need the child for inheritance purposes. The Thompson family trust requires an heir. But Elena will have served her purpose by then. Whitman attempted immediate damage control, jumping to his feet with objections about privacy and illegal recording, but Judge Chen overruled him with cutting efficiency. The recording was made in a hotel hallway, which is a public space, she ruled. The plaintiff had every right to be there, and she recorded a conversation that was clearly audible to anyone who might have been passing by. The evidence is admissible. Continue. Ms. Santos. The second wave of evidence came through Marcus Rodriguez's methodical testimony about Richard's money laundering operation. The former FBI agent took the witness stand with the calm authority of someone who had spent 20 years building cases against sophisticated financial criminals. Using charts, financial documents, and a presentation that revealed the scope of Richard's crimes with devastating clarity, Marcus explained how Richard had created 15 shell companies to funnel stolen money through fake real estate deals. Mr. Thompson would establish a company with an official-sounding name like Manhattan Development Partners or Thompson Premium Properties, Marcus testified, pointing to a chart that tracked money flows across multiple accounts. He would then claim to be purchasing existing buildings or developing new construction projects in prime Manhattan locations. Investors would transfer millions of dollars based on these claims, but the buildings either didn't exist or were never actually purchased. Marcus continued, his voice steady and factual as he described crimes that grew more audacious with each example. The stolen money would then be transferred through a series of offshore accounts in the Cayman Islands, Switzerland, and Luxembourg, before eventually ending up in accounts controlled by Victoria Sterling. Over a 3-year period, Mr. Thompson and Ms. Sterling stole approximately $53 million from investors who believed they were funding legitimate Manhattan development projects. Elena watched the jury as Marcus methodically destroyed any possibility that Richard's crimes could be dismissed as simple business mistakes or accounting errors. These were deliberate, sophisticated criminal acts that had been planned and executed with careful attention to avoiding detection. Whitman's cross-examination of Marcus was aggressive, but ultimately futile. The evidence was too complete, too well documented, and too clearly presented for any defense attorney to overcome through courtroom theatrics. Mr. Rodriguez, Whitman began, isn't it true that you were dismissed from the FBI under questionable circumstances related to your investigation methods? I retired from the FBI after 20 years of exemplary service, Marcus replied calmly. My personnel file, which is part of the evidence in this case, shows numerous commendations for successful investigations of financial crimes. But you're being paid by the plaintiff to provide testimony that supports her case, correct? I'm being paid to provide expert analysis of financial documents and to explain complex money laundering schemes to the court, Marcus corrected. My conclusions are based entirely on documentary evidence, not on who is paying my consulting fee. Whitman continued his attack, but Marcus remained unshakable. Every question was answered with facts. Every accusation was met with documentation. Every attempt at intimidation was deflected with professional competence. The courtroom's attention shifted dramatically when Maria called Elena herself to the witness stand. Elena stood slowly, smoothing her skirt and checking that Isabella was sleeping peacefully in her carrier, then walked to the witness stand with the dignified bearing of someone who had nothing to hide and everything to fight for. Mrs. Thompson, Maria began gently after Elena had been sworn in, please tell the court about your educational and professional background. Elena's voice was clear and confident as she recounted her journey from San Juan to Harvard to Manhattan. She spoke about her architectural training, her early career designing affordable housing, her decision to scale back her practice after marriage, and her plans to return to work after Isabella's birth. Now, Mrs. Thompson, please tell the court about the night you discovered your husband's infidelity. Elena recounted that devastating evening at the Plaza Hotel in precise detail, her voice growing stronger as she spoke. She described the accidental phone call, her decision to investigate, the cruel conversation she had overheard between Richard and Victoria. And what was your emotional state after this discovery? I was devastated, Elena replied honestly. Not just by the infidelity, but by the callousness. These people were discussing my life, my baby's future, as if we were business problems to be solved rather than human beings with feelings and rights. Maria guided Elena through her testimony with careful precision, establishing not just the facts of Richard's betrayal, but the emotional context that explained Elena's subsequent actions. Mrs. Thompson, during your marriage, did you observe anything unusual about your husband's business practices? This was the moment Elena had been preparing for. Drawing on her architectural training and her natural attention to detail, she methodically described the inconsistencies she had noticed in Richard's claimed development projects. As an architect familiar with Manhattan real estate, I knew that some of the projects Richard claimed to be developing couldn't exist, Elena testified. He spoke about building a 40-story residential tower on a lot in Soho that was only zoned for 10-story buildings. He claimed to be developing luxury condominiums in areas that weren't economically viable for that type of housing. Elena's testimony was devastating because it came from someone with professional expertise in exactly the field where Richard was committing his crimes. She wasn't just a suspicious wife, she was an expert witness who had been living inside Richard's criminal operation without realizing it. Did you ever question your husband about these inconsistencies? Yes, but he would tell me not to worry about business details or that I didn't understand the complexities of real estate finance. Elena replied, I began to think that perhaps I was mistaken, that there were aspects of development that I didn't understand despite my architectural training. Mrs. Thompson, what made you decide to investigate further? Elena paused, choosing her words carefully. After that night at the plaza, I realized that Richard had been lying to me about much more than just his fidelity. I began to think about all the conversations I had overheard, all the business dealings that had never made sense. As an architect, I'm trained to look for structural problems, to identify when something isn't built on a solid foundation. I realized that Richard's entire business might be structurally unsound. The metaphor was perfect. Elena, the architect, had discovered that Richard the developer was building his empire on fraudulent foundations that were destined to collapse. Whitman's cross-examination of Elena was brutal and comprehensive. He attacked her memory, her motives, her professional competence, and her character. But Elena had spent months preparing for this moment, and she answered each question with calm precision. Isn't it true, Ms. Martinez, that you seduced my client while he was vulnerable following his father's death? I met Richard at a charity fundraiser for Hurricane Maria relief efforts in Puerto Rico. Elena replied evenly. I was there as a volunteer architect helping design emergency housing. Richard was there as a donor. We were introduced by mutual friends and began dating several months later. And isn't it true that you immediately began pressuring him for marriage and children? We dated for 2 years before Richard proposed to me during a trip to Italy. Elena said, the engagement was his idea, as was the timeline for our wedding. The pregnancy was planned and celebrated by both of us. I have ultrasound photos that Richard posted on his social media accounts to document his excitement about becoming a father. But you admit that you married him primarily for his wealth and social status. Elena's eyes flashed with anger, but her voice remained controlled. I married Richard because I loved him. I had my own successful architectural practice and my own financial independence. I didn't need Richard's money. I chose to share my life with him because I believed he was a good man who loved me in return. As the cross-examination continued, Elena's credibility only grew stronger. Every attack on her character was met with factual responses. Every attempt to paint her as a gold digger was contradicted by evidence of her professional achievements and financial independence. Every suggestion that she was lying was undermined by the detailed consistency of her testimony. The final phase of Elena's testimony focused on the evidence she had gathered from Richard's safe. Maria walked her through the discovery process with careful attention to legal requirements. Elena had legal access to the penthouse. She had known the safe combination for years, and she had every right to examine documents related to marital finances. Mrs. Thompson, please describe what you found in your husband's safe. Elena's voice was steady as she described the USB drive, the offshore bank statements, the contracts for phantom real estate developments, and the detailed records of money transfers to Victoria's accounts. How did you feel when you realized the scope of what you had discovered? I felt sick, Elena admitted. Not just because of the betrayal, but because I realized that innocent people had lost money because of Richard's crimes. Investors who trusted him with their retirement savings, with their children's college funds, with money they had worked their entire lives to accumulate. This was the moment that transformed Elena from victim to hero in the eyes of the jury. She wasn't just fighting for her own rights, she was fighting for all of Richard's victims. As Elena returned to her seat, she felt the shift in the courtroom's atmosphere. Richard's lawyers were now clearly on the defensive, and Victoria had slipped out during Elena's testimony. probably realizing that her own legal jeopardy was about to become very real. The prosecution's case continued with FBI agents who had been investigating Richard's operation, with victims who had lost money to his fraudulent schemes, and with financial experts who explained the complex mechanics of international money laundering to the jury. Each witness added another layer to the case against Richard, but Elena's testimony remained the foundation that held everything together. She was the one who had lived inside Richard's criminal organization, who had observed his methods firsthand, who had risked everything to gather the evidence that made prosecution possible. Judge Chen called for a lunch recess, during which Richard's legal team engaged in frantic negotiations with prosecutors about possible plea bargains. Elena spent the break in a small conference room with Maria, Isabella, and Marcus, feeling emotionally drained but legally victorious. "How do you think it's going?" Elena asked, though she could read the answer in Maria's satisfied expression. "Richard is finished," Maria replied with calm certainty. "His lawyers know it, the prosecutors know it, and most importantly, Richard knows it. The only question now is whether he'll try to take everyone down with him or attempt to minimize his sentence through cooperation." When court reconvened, Whitman made a final, desperate attempt to salvage his client's case by calling character witnesses, business associates, and social acquaintances who testified to Richard's reputation and charitable contributions. But their testimony felt hollow and irrelevant in the face of the documentary evidence that had been presented. Richard himself never took the stand. His lawyers clearly understood that cross-examination would only make his situation worse. Judge Chen's instructions to the jury were comprehensive and clear. She explained the legal standards for the civil case, the divorce, and asset division, as well as the criminal referrals that would follow regardless of the jury's decision on the family court matters. The jury deliberated for less than 3 hours. When they returned, the foreman stood to deliver a verdict that would reshape Elena's life and destroy Richard's empire forever. "In the matter of Thompson versus Thompson," the foreman began, "we find in favor of the plaintiff on all counts. We award Mrs. Elena Martinez Thompson 60% of all marital assets, including the Manhattan penthouse, the Hamptons estate, the art collection, and all shares in Thompson Real Estate." Elena felt tears streaming down her face, but they were tears of relief and vindication rather than sorrow. "Furthermore," the foreman continued, "we find that Mr. Thompson engaged in financial fraud that constitutes marital misconduct warranting additional damages. We award Mrs. Martinez Thompson $5 million in compensatory damages for emotional distress and financial harm. Finally, we recommend that all evidence in this case be immediately forwarded to federal prosecutors for criminal investigation and prosecution." The courtroom erupted in chaos as reporters rushed to file breaking news reports, and Richard's business associates fled to avoid being photographed leaving the courthouse. Richard himself sat motionless at the defendant's table, his face pale and his eyes staring at nothing. Judge Chen restored order with several sharp strikes of her gavel, then delivered her own judicial findings. "Mr. Thompson," she said, looking directly at Richard, "I have presided over divorce cases for 15 years, and I have never seen evidence of such systematic deception and criminal behavior. You have not only betrayed your wife and child, you have betrayed the trust of investors, the integrity of our financial system, and the basic principles of human decency." She continued, her voice carrying the weight of absolute moral authority. "I am immediately referring this case to federal prosecutors with a recommendation for the strongest possible criminal charges. I am also ordering the immediate freezing of all Thompson real estate assets, pending criminal investigation." "Mrs. Martinez Thompson," Judge Chen said, turning to Elena, "you have shown extraordinary courage in bringing this case forward. You have not only secured justice for yourself and your daughter, you have protected future victims and upheld the rule of law. This court commends your bravery and your commitment to truth." As Elena walked out of the courthouse carrying Isabella and flanked by Maria and Marcus, reporters shouted questions from every direction. Elena stopped at the top of the courthouse steps, looking back at the building where she had just reclaimed not only her life, but her identity as a woman who would not be silently destroyed. Justice is not always swift, she said into the microphones thrust toward her, but it is inevitable. Today, my daughter and I have been vindicated, but more importantly, other women will see that it's possible to fight back against powerful men who think they can destroy us without consequences. Behind her, through the courthouse windows, Elena could see Richard Thompson being led away in handcuffs by FBI agents who had been waiting for the verdict. Victoria Sterling was already in federal custody, arrested at JFK Airport while attempting to board a flight to Switzerland with suitcases full of cash and jewelry. Elena Martinez Thompson had won more than a divorce settlement. She had exposed a criminal conspiracy, protected future victims, and proven that no one, no matter how wealthy or powerful, is above the law when confronted by a woman with nothing left to lose and everything to fight for. As she walked toward her new life with Isabella in her arms, Elena whispered in Spanish, "We did it, mi amor. We won." The phoenix had not just risen from the ashes, she had set fire to the empire that had tried to destroy her. 5 years later, spring 2030, the morning sun streamed through the floor-to-ceiling windows of Elena's corner office on the 32nd floor of the Martinez building, casting golden light across architectural blueprints and awards that told the story of a remarkable transformation. Below, Central Park stretched out in all its spring glory, the same view Elena had once watched from Richard's penthouse. But now everything was different. The woman standing at those windows was no longer a victim or even a survivor. She was a force of nature who had rebuilt not just her own life, but the lives of thousands of women around the world. Elena Martinez Rivera, she had taken Alessandro's name when they married 2 years ago, was now 35 years old and at the height of her power and influence. The shy architect who had once deferred to her husband's business judgment had become one of New York's most successful developers, specializing in affordable housing and sustainable design. The Phoenix Foundation, which had started as Elena's personal mission to help women in crisis, had grown into a global organization with centers in 43 countries and an annual budget of over $50 million. But on this particular morning, Elena wasn't thinking about business or philanthropy. She was watching 5-year-old Isabella play in the children's area of her office, a space Elena had designed specifically so her daughter could spend time with her at work when needed. Isabella was bent over a drawing tablet, creating architectural plans for what she called her princess castle for all the mommy's friends. "Mommy, look," Isabella called out in the perfect bilingual switching that characterized her generation of global children. "I made rooms for the ladies to read books, and a kitchen where they can cook food from their countries, and a big playroom for their kids." Elena knelt beside her daughter, marveling at the sophisticated spatial thinking already evident in Isabella's drawings. The little girl had inherited more than just Elena's dark eyes and Alessandro's stubborn chin. She had also inherited a natural understanding of how spaces could be designed to nurture and protect people. "It's beautiful, mi amor," Elena said, gathering Isabella into her arms. "Tell me about this room here. That's where the mommies go when they're sad," Isabella explained with the matter-of-fact wisdom of a child who had grown up around Phoenix Foundation centers. "They can cry there, and then they feel better, and then they can be strong again like you." Elena felt her heart swell with pride and love. Isabella had never known the fear and powerlessness that had defined Elena's pregnancy. She was growing up in a world where women's strength was celebrated, where multilingual communication was the norm, and where helping others was simply part of daily life. Alessandro Rivera entered the office carrying espresso and bearing his characteristic morning smile. At 40, the Italian architect had the kind of quiet confidence that came from knowing exactly who he was and what he valued. He had been Elena's partner in every sense for 3 years, professionally collaborating on sustainable design projects that had won international awards, personally supporting her foundation work without trying to control or direct it, and parentally loving Isabella as completely as if she were his biological daughter. "Good morning, my brilliant women," Alessandro said in his accented English, handing Elena her coffee and ruffling Isabella's dark curls. "Ready for today's adventure?" Today was indeed special. Elena was being honored at the United Nations as a goodwill ambassador for women's economic empowerment, a recognition of her work creating sustainable economic opportunities for women escaping domestic violence and financial abuse. But before the ceremony, they had one final piece of business to conclude a meeting that would officially close the chapter of Elena's life that had begun with Richard Thompson's betrayal. The Phoenix Foundation headquarters occupied 4 floors of the Martinez building, a gleaming tower that Elena had designed and developed as the centerpiece of a new model for socially responsible real estate development. The building featured affordable housing units, commercial spaces reserved for women-owned businesses, and community facilities that were open to the public. It was everything Richard's fraudulent developments had pretended to be a genuine contribution to the city's economic and social fabric. Elena's personal office was a study in purposeful design. The walls displayed architectural drawings from her most important projects, alongside photographs from Phoenix Foundation centers around the world. Awards and honors covered one wall: the National Architecture Prize, the UN Humanitarian Award, recognition as one of Fortune magazine's most powerful women in business. But Elena's favorites were the handwritten letters from women whose lives had been changed by the foundation's work. Maria Santos knocked on the office door at exactly 9 a.m., carrying the confident energy of a woman who had just been elected Manhattan District Attorney on a platform of prosecuting white-collar crime and protecting women's rights. Maria's career had flourished alongside Elena's. The Thompson case had made her reputation as a prosecutor who could take down powerful men, and she had parlayed that success into political office and real influence over New York's criminal justice system. Ready to close the book on Richard Thompson forever? Maria asked, embracing Elena warmly. I've been ready for 5 years, Elena replied, though her voice carried more satisfaction than bitterness. How are he and Victoria adjusting to freedom? Richard Thompson had served 4 years of a 12-year sentence before being released on parole for good behavior and cooperation with federal authorities investigating other financial crimes. His testimony had led to the prosecution of dozens of other white-collar criminals, and he had been required to pay full restitution to his victims as a condition of his plea agreement. Victoria Sterling had served 3 years of an 8-year sentence before being deported to Romania with a lifetime ban on returning to the United States. Her cooperation with authorities had been less extensive than Richard's, and her attitude throughout the legal process had remained defiant and unrepentant. Richard has been living quietly in Montreal, Maria reported, working construction, attending therapy, staying completely out of trouble. His parole officer says he's genuinely committed to rehabilitation. PN Victoria disappeared completely after her deportation. Interpol thinks she might be working under an assumed name somewhere in Eastern Europe, but she's no longer our problem. The final meeting of the day took place in a small conference room at the federal courthouse, the same building where Elena's transformation from victim to victor had played out 5 years earlier. Richard Thompson sat across from Elena, separated by a simple wooden table and a gulf of experience that could never be bridged. Richard, now 45, looked like a different person from the confident mogul who had once commanded Manhattan real estate deals. Prison had aged him dramatically. His hair was completely gray, his face was deeply lined, and his once powerful frame had grown.